Welcome to Chats with Champions. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to please turn off your cell phones. We're taping today's chats, which can be accessed through our website, as well as checked out of the library. Chats is presented by Skidompha Library and sponsored by the first Dean Scotta, chartered in the mid-1800s and located on Main Street. It has 15 branches along the coast of Maine, and as you see the sign across the street, is celebrating its 150th anniversary. Our next chat is on Tuesday, July 8th, and the speaker will be Adam Hochschild, author of To End All Wars, A Story of War and Rebellion. Our speaker today is award-winning and New York Times best-selling author, Julia Spencer-Fleming, whose birthday, by the way, is today.
I'm 40.
A former military brat, New York Times best-selling author Julia Spencer-Fleming grew up in places as diverse as Montgomery, Rome, Stuttgart, and Syracuse. A graduate of Ithaca College, George Washington University, and the University of Maine School of Law, she took up writing while a stay-at-home mom of 2. During the time it took to finish her third novel, she had her third child. Right?
Yes.
She had a third child. Mm-hmm. She didn't want to write yet another lawyer-sleuth, so she used her Army pass and a keen eye for the goings-on in her Episcopal church to create Clare Fergusson, first female priest in the small Adirondack town of Miller's Kill. The resulting series has won or been nominated for every American History Award, including the Edgar, the Anthony, and the Agatha. Her most recent book is Through the Evil Days. Now happily quit of the war. I've never heard it said that way, but that's what you said. Julia lives in the Maine countryside with her husband, daughter, and occasionally a couple of college students. It's my pleasure to present Julia Spencer-Fleming.
All right, I'm going to try it over here. Can you all hear me if I speak? Okay, good. I hate standing behind podiums, but I need to obey Mel's orders for my taping, so I'll try and keep here. If I start to roam over there, everybody tell me to get back here. Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back in Skidompha. I was thinking when I was writing this down in my date book that I feel like I've lived in Maine now for 27 years. I moved here as a brand new bride, and I think I started to feel like, I can't call myself really a Mainer, but I feel like you've really passed something when you don't even have to think about how to spell Damascata and Skidompha. You know what they are. So I thought, okay, well that's good. That's a check mark. In New York State, it's can you spell Schenectady without looking at it? So I'm actually originally from New York State, from the upstate Piedmont of the Adirondack that I write about. The reason I started writing about that instead of Maine is precisely because when I began writing back in the late 90s, I didn't feel like I had lived in Maine long enough to really know it. There are a lot of writers who, and I know some of them, who can write about places that, they'll read a Wikipedia article, look at some pictures online, and they can write about a place. I'm not like that. I really have to feel like I know the place that I'm writing about in a very bone deep level. And that is Washington County, New York, where I come from. My family settled in that area in 1720 and has lived there, one or the other of us, ever since. And when I was a kid and we were in the military, my grandparents lived there in the house that had been, her parents and then her parents before. And it was the place that we went to for holidays and on summer vacations. Sometimes my parents would be traveling or be off in a different state somewhere, and they would just send us kids, and we would spend the summer with my grandparents. And when we got out of the military, that was where we moved and settled. We lived there for about 4 years before my folks relocated to outside the Syracuse area, which is where they live now. And in those times, it was wonderful. It was when I was in my very early teens. So I had kind of the perfect level of autonomy and lack of responsibility. And this was in the 70s, and you could still just, you get home from the school bus, and my mom believed in getting lots of fresh air and exercise first, and then homework after dinner. So I would just go out, and as long as I came back home when the fire department, the volunteer fire department blew a whistle at 6 o'clock, and you knew you had to come home. It sounds very idyllic nowadays. But that was, the result is I got to wander around a lot, I got to talk to people a lot, and I was a quiet, bookish child, which is a little bit hard to imagine nowadays. And so, when grown-ups would be getting together, my extended family or friends and family, I would hear all sorts of talk that I really wasn't supposed to hear, because I'd be in there in the corner with my nose in, Little House on the Prairie or something, and people would be gossiping about, who was pregnant and who, was trying to get pregnant and who shouldn't have been pregnant, and which is another thing that I think has given me my lifelong fascination with small towns. You all, if you're from here, you live in a small town. And the interesting thing about small towns is that it's got, and I think I say this in one of the books, I have a character say, they have just as many vices and problems as a large city. It's just that you're likely to know the person who has the problem or commits the crime if they do it. And I find that endlessly interesting. So how did I go from wandering around Washington County, New York to writing? I got married, as I mentioned, came here, went to University of Maine School of Law, one of the 10 roundest law schools in the country. That's only a joke if you've seen it. It's literally round buildings. We came up with it as a superlative, because when I went there really weren't a lot of other superlatives for it. It looks like a giant kerosene heater, actually. That was the other thing the students called it, kerosene heater. And I worked for a little bit in law, and then immediately had my first 2 children pretty much back to back. And so I was a stay-at-home mom for a number of years. And full-time mothering, if any of you have done it, is just a grueling and intensive, it's like, being at war. It's like the Baton Death March of toddlerhood. And so I did that, for about 5 years straight. And then our oldest, Victoria, started kindergarten. And just to give you a sense of the time scale here, Victoria, this past May, just graduated from Smith College, so it was a while ago. So she started kindergarten, and at that time we put our son into preschool for 3 mornings a week. So after 5 years of nonstop, close quarter motherhood, I suddenly had 3 long mornings every week, completely child free. It was amazing. It was like, freedom! And I was at that stage, I kind of wanted to explore, what do I want to do? I've got married, I got the house and the dog and the kids, and what do I want to do? My husband, who actually paid my way through law school, suggested that I might want to get a job. I thought that might be a little bit too out there and experimental. And then, I thought, well, I could do sort of crafty things, but I'm horrible at crafts. My kid, my oldest, who's kind of a smarty, once called me the anti-craft, so. So I wound up getting involved with an online writers group. And interestingly enough, a mystery writers group. It was a science fiction writers group. I had been on a bulletin board discussion about science fiction books, which I loved. I still love to read science fiction. And that was what, having a dad in the Air Force, he was a big science fiction fan, and we had the Science Fiction Book of the Month Club, and I read all those classics from the 50s and the 60s. And so a group within this book discussion club said, we're going to start a little writers group and it'll be fun. And I thought, yeah, that'll be fun. It'll be like my little hobby thing. Yeah, it worked out well for a hobby, actually. So I started doing some stuff for this science fiction writing group, and I wrote some short stories and some character sketches, and started reading and studying up about writing so I could get better at it. And I very quickly came to realize a couple things. One was I was good at writing fiction. I hadn't really put my hand to it before. When I was a teenager, I'd written a lot of bad poetry and really angsty stories where very thinly veiled versions of myself had terrible things happen to them, and then they would die, and then everybody would feel really, really sorry that they hadn't been nicer to her when she was there. Which I hope to God have been lost in one of our moves, because if my mother still has them, I'm in trouble. They'll show up on Amazon one of these days. But I had never tried writing fiction in the real sense of it before, and I loved it, and I was good at it. And I felt like writing just sort of fed something in me that the other jobs that I'd done did not feed. And so I decided I was going to sort of step out there and try to write a novel. And to this day, I cannot remember the exact thought process, if there was one, that went into it. I usually compare it to the decision to get married. It's sort of like, yeah, it seems like a good idea, let's give it a shot, see what happens. That turned out well too, I should say. Obviously I just need to make these decisions and just go with them. So I wrote about half of a science fiction novel, and I took it to a large writing workshop and workshopped it there with two very well-known published authors and a writing instructor and another group of people. And in the workshopping experience, everybody has about 30 pages, and you share it, and everyone reads it, critiques it. So they all had the same comments about my work. Everyone said that my prose was of publishable quality, my characters were well-rounded and well-developed, and my ideas about science fiction were hackneyed, cliched, and unmarketable. I know. So really, you see before you a failed science fiction author. But of course, at that point, I really wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a story and get published and get it out there. So mostly it was kind of like that. What I heard was that thing in, remember the Charlie Brown where the grown-ups talk and you just hear wah, 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 wah. That was kind of what I heard. It was publishable quality, wah, wah, great characters, wah, wah, wah. So I took my half a book back home and I took a look at it, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? Do I rewrite and stuff? And I will describe a little bit about it, and if you've read any of my books, you will see the legacy here. It was set on a space station with about 10,000 people in it, sort of a small town. The heroine was a ex-military officer turned social services professional, and the hero was the attractive but remote chief of security of the space station. So they were, as it were, Russ and Claire's great-grandparents. And the thing is that the whole story, on the third page of the manuscript, the heroine finds a body in her office. And the whole plot was, who's the dead body, who killed him, and can they find and stop the killer before he strikes again? Completely without intending to or meaning to, I wrote a mystery. Or at least I wrote the easy part, which is the first half of the mystery, when you don't have to figure out the answer to those questions. And so I thought to myself, a moment of brilliant insight, maybe I should try writing a mystery. So, not wanting to do something that was going to be hackneyed, cliched, and unmarketable, I did a little research. I went to the Portland Public Library, which is the closest large library to me, and I took out every book that I could find, every mystery, that had won one of the big three, which is the Agatha, the Anthony, and the Edgar Awards. And I read probably 30 books. I outlined some of them. I did some reverse engineering so I could see how the author did what he or she did. The interesting thing about mystery writing is that along with everything that you have to put in a novel, that is credible dialogue, believable characters, conflict, and then mystery also involves a lot of sleight of hand and misdirection. And at the end, of course, the curtain lifts and the reader needs to see everything. I often compare it to doing a piece of needlework, if any of you does needlework or knitting, where it has to be reversible. And so on one side, the reader sees the picture forming, but at the end of the book, the author turns it around, and you need to see all those threads need to line up neatly where they were. And so there's a lot of kind of, I'm showing you this and hiding something behind my back that has to be in. So I paid a lot of attention to that, to try to figure out how writers did that. And that was my mystery writing course. I took the books back to Portland Public Library. I paid a very hefty fine because I kept them paid. And I started writing in the midwinter. And that was the first book that I ever started and got to the end of. And wrote the sweetest words in any writer's vocabulary, the end. It's even better now because when I first started, my first couple of manuscripts, I would write it, and then, I'd have to get it, I'd have to take it wasn't even a stick back then, what did we use? I wrote my first book in '99, and like 2000, were we doing CDs back then? I don't think it was a floppy, but it might have been this, but it was close, and take it to Kinko's and have them printed out and then packaged up and send it, mail it off to my publishing company. And now all you do, you finish it and you just press a button and boom, it goes off to your editor. Which is even better, because then you just feel like brat kicked it right out the door. Writing is a great art, as you can tell. So during the time that I wrote, it took me about a year and a half to write my first book. And during that time, I went back to work full-time for the noted Maine law firm, law offices of Joe Bornstein. I get a royalty from Joe every time I do it. So I went back to work for Joe Bornstein, and I had our third child, and finished the book. I actually finished the book about a month before I finished the child, which was good, because if it had been the other way around, that thing would still be sitting in a drawer somewhere. But then I was in a quandary. I was working full-time. I'd been home for maternity leave for 8 weeks, but I was working full-time. I had 2 kids in elementary school and a new baby. And I was at that stage in motherhood where you feel like it's a huge accomplishment if you actually take a shower that day. And you remember that, right? I take a shower regularly now, so feel free to come up and talk to me later on. But I thought, I'm never going to get this book out there, because of course what you're supposed to do is send the book out to agents that you've researched and do lovely, carefully crafted query letters, and do a synopsis of your book that shows your brilliance and the plot, and that wasn't happening. And then I read about the St. Martin's Malice Domestic Best First Traditional Mystery Contest, or the SMMD BFTM. BFD. That's very long, don't you think? I had a talk with my my most recent editor, and I said, you guys should think about shortening that. She said, well, to what? And I said, how about the Pulitzer Prize? I don't think there are copyright issues, so that's not going to work. So the gist of the contest is, and this is still going on, so if you or someone you know is an aspiring mystery author, all you have to do is have a completed manuscript. They're specifically for traditional mysteries, so that you have to have an amateur sleuth, not someone who is, primarily tasked with solving crime. It needs to have a closed circle of suspects, so the killer is not, a maniac serial killer who comes out in the end slashing. And it needs to have either, I don't remember what it says, either, no graphic sex and explicit violence or explicit sex and graphic violence. I was writing about an Episcopal priest in a tiny town in upstate New York, so there wasn't much of either of that in that book. Later on, all bets are off. And anyway, you have a complete manuscript, you ship it off, and if you win, you get a publishing contract for hard and soft cover, and a very nice advance for first-time authors. So this is what I did. I wrapped it up, I sent it off, and I immediately began dreaming of the glamorous life that would be mine when I became a professionally published author, which at that time mostly consisted of never having to do laundry again, which I'm sad to say has not at all come true. In fact, now the college kids are back, I'm doing a load a day again. Sometimes I stand there, measuring stuff in the machine. I think, does John Grisham have to do this? Laundry every day. Okay, I'll tell you my best glamorous life of the author story. So, my previous book, One Was a Soldier, is the first book of mine that made it onto the New York Times bestseller list. And it's a big deal. And what happens is that when they have a pretty good idea, your publisher has a pretty good idea based on the sales figures if you might make it in. And the Times, if you are on the list, the Times calls your publisher and your agent, and they let them know. And then they call you, and all this, of course, happens at the very end of the business day. So, and on Wednesday, before the paper comes out. So that whole Wednesday, I'm like schlepping around, thinking I'm going to throw up at any minute. It's like, oh, I make it. 6 o'clock, my publisher calls, my agent calls, everybody's happy, I'm on the list. They're having a party at my publisher's. My husband pulls out this bottle of really, really nice champagne that he put on ice, and I was like, oh, what if I hadn't gotten it? And he said, well, we drowned our sorrows. And then because, we had our 13-year-old at home, and it was a school night, we watched the King's Speech and had takeout pizza, and that was good. We killed the champagne bottle, though, between the two of us. That was nice. So the next morning, I wake up. I'm sort of radiant in my New York Times best-sellingness. That night, I said to my husband, the night before, I said, have you ever slept with a New York Times best-selling author? I said, the answer better be no. So I get up and I'm like, hi, I'm a New York Times bestseller. And my husband's downstairs because he's a real early riser, and I kind of waft down the stairs, and I stand in the kitchen, basking in the glow of my own awesomeness, and my husband said, oh good, you're down, the cat's pan needs changing. Truly a prophet in his own land, So, okay, that was a digression. Where were we? Oh, I shipped off my manuscript. The contest, runs until April, and what I really was hoping that I would do with the contest was make a contact. I knew no one in publishing. I had absolutely no strings to pull, and I thought I knew editors would be looking at it, so I thought I could get a recommendation for an agent, or some suggestions about where I should shop it, or even just suggestions on making it a stronger book. And so I was very surprised when I got home, and the way I found out was this. I'd gotten home, and for some reason I only had Victoria with me that day. Ross, my husband, must have been picking up the two younger kids. We were both working in law firms, and I got home and we still had the answering machine. Some of you may still have this, but they're also going away in the past, where you press the button and it plays everything and you listen to it out loud. And it was that Victoria's dumping her stuff on the table and I'm putting the dog's dish down and throwing stuff into the microwave and I'm listening and people, oh, it's from your church, can you do this and that, And then I heard, hello, this is Ruth Cavan of St. Martin's Press. I'm looking for Julia Spencer-Fleming. The machine had our family name, my married name, which is different than my maiden name, which is what I run under. And we let, I just sent her an email. And I go, oh my God, and I go running over to the computer and I mash it on. And this was 2001, we had dial-up, so it took 15 minutes to get online. So the whole time, it's going bee-bom, bee-bom, and the whole time I'm doing, the New England dance of self-abnegation. I'm like, oh, it couldn't be me. It's just, maybe they're thanking me for entering. And my daughter, from the depths of 9 years of wisdom, this is the smarts that got into Smith College, said, Mom, they don't call you if you're a loser. So she was right, and that was in fact the email saying that I had beaten out 200 other books, manuscripts, and that they were offering me a contract and hired me softcover. So I was going to become a published author. And I have to tell you, I always say, if my kids are within earshot, I always say, next to having my children, it was the best dream. But honestly, better. Because one, there are no stitches involved, and two, they give you a check, which, believe you me, is not my experience as a parent. I used to tell people, please buy my books so I don't have to go back to being a lawyer. And I say, please buy my books so I can pay college tuition for my kids. So there it was. I was going to be published. About 6 weeks after we had signed the deal, I got another call from Ruth, she's my late editor, marvelous woman. She says, we love Clare Fergusson. We think she's such a fabulous, fabulous character. And it'll make a terrific series. And have you started the second book? So of course I said, why yes. And I had in fact been thinking a lot about the second book, which any author will tell you. Thinking about the book is almost practically just about the next best thing to actually write it. If they someday invent a mechanism by which we can just beam the stories into your heads, writers' lives will become immeasurably easier. Just here's what I'm thinking, and then, I think I told her I had like 3 chapters, but they were handwritten and I'd have to type them out. And I was a slow typist, and I get back to her. And I gave myself 1 week, and again, leaping back to the computer, and I banged out 2.5 chapters of what became my second book, Fountain Filled with Blood. I got about halfway through the 3rd chapter, and that was as far as I got by the deadline I set for myself. And I wrote, I can't remember, something or the other that I knew was going to happen. And there's a helicopter crash, because I knew I wanted that to happen. And then they find the killer. And I had no idea who the killer was, what the killer was doing, why the killer had killed. But I knew that at the end, in a mystery, you have to find the killer. So I thought it was a pretty safe bet. And I sent that off, and as my husband likes to say, they bought it. And I have actually been with St. Martin's Minotaur. Minotaur is the imprint of St. Martin's. Now for, which book is this out? My eighth books. And I'm working on the 9th in the series for them, and I'm under contract for another one after that at this point. So there will be at least 10. And who knows? If people like it and my kids want to go into grad school, there may be more. So what I try and do, let me tell you briefly what I do in the books, and then we'll do questions and answers, which is the interesting part for me. So what I try and do in my books, every time I write a book, I try to set myself, I try and push the envelope for me as a writer a little bit. I want to do something different I want to stretch myself as a writer. I want to not be bored writing it, and I want you to not be bored reading it. So hopefully, if you pick up a book with my name on it, you'll have a lot of the similar things. You know, there's going to be, you know, forbidden romance, there's going to be a lot of adventure, there's going to be, you know, twisty mystery, there's going to be social commentary, but it'll be a little bit different every time. The first book, In the Bleak Midwinter, my goal was to simply do a straightforward mystery that hooked the reader with the very first line, which is, it was a hell of a night to throw away a baby. Isn't that a great first line? That is the best first line I will ever write in my life. But it's okay, I don't have to reproduce it because it was in the first book. So that, anyway, to hook the reader and just sort of reel you in, sort of with the line getting tauter and tauter and faster and faster until you reach the end of the book, close and go, oh, I wonder what happens next. My second book, A Fountain Filled with Blood, the challenge that I set for myself was to take two things that had nothing to do with each other. In this case, PCB pollution in the Upper Hudson Valley, which, if anyone knows the area, is a real and ongoing issue there, and gay bashing. And the gay bashing was actually based on a real episode that occurred in Falmouth back in the late 90s. And to take these two things that have nothing to do with each other, and to twist them and twist them and twist them until we get to the end of the book and discover that they are, in fact, the same thing. The third book, Out of the Deep I Cry, is my homage. Homage is a French word that means rip-off, of Sharon Crumb, who is an author whose work I very much admire and I recommend to you. She does a series called the Appalachian Ballad series set in, I think, the sort of trans-mountain area, Tennessee and North Carolina. And one of the themes that she goes back to is the bad thing that happened in the past. And I thought, that's perfect for my small town, because as you know, in a small town, things may be buried, but they're never really dead. So it's a story that in the present goes over the 40 days of Lent, the period leading up to Easter. In the past, it goes backwards from the 60s and 50s and 40s back to the 1920s, the bootlegging era, and then the stories, we find out what the bad thing was, and the stories link up. The fourth book, To Darkness and to Death, was sort of, I wanted to do a switch. As I write more books, I now realize that my books often come in pairs. I kind of write one and then I'll write the next book in response to that. So the third book takes place, one of the stories is over 70 years, so my fourth book, To Darkness and to Death, takes place in 24 hours. I wanted to see if I could do a ticking clock mystery. We see ticking clock thrillers all the time, but a mystery like that. And it's about the closing of the last sort of area of freestanding timber in the area, and the industries that are affected by it. And I remember when I told Ross, my husband, about this, because I don't discuss my books in progress a lot, but I let him know what's going on. And I said, yes, it's about family timbering and, you know, and losing the business and the environmental, and he got this glazed look on his face and said, I hope to God you put sex in this one. But really, it's very interesting and quite thrilling. The fifth one, All Mortal Flesh, takes a very, very standard old mystery trope. The detective becomes the suspect. In this book, the chief of police, Russ Van Alstyne's wife, is found dead on the kitchen floor. And I'm not giving it away because it says it right on the back of the book. So you can see it as and of course he is the #1 suspect in her murder because everyone in town assumes he's having an affair with Clare Fergusson, the Episcopal priest. And at the end of that book, I left the characters in a very, very dark and depressing place. The book has a number of references. Sometimes I also like to take a much better quality literary work than I can do and work it in a little bit or frame some of my thoughts around it. In that case, it was Dante's Inferno. So if you read the book and you think about Dante's Inferno, it actually starts with a quote, and then there are different forms of the sins that occur in the circles, and then they end in a still frozen circle with everything right at the center, which of course is at the end of Inferno. The next book after that, I Shall Not Want, what I was looking at for my literary inspiration were actually Shakespearean comedies of all things. So in that book, which is, the issue is illegal, or I'm sorry, migrant workers working up in what is basically the Northern Kingdom. It's very much like Vermont in that area. But there are mistaken identities and couples going in and out of the woods and falling in love, and it ends in a marriage, as all good comedies do. And there's actually more funny, lighthearted stuff in that. I really needed to kind of bring it up a little bit after the really depressing stuff in the 5th book. The 7th book, One Was a Soldier, was a book that I really wanted to write for a long time. As you know, we had a lot of National Guardsmen and women here in Maine who were deployed multiple times, the engineering battalions out of Bangor. And I had been sort of following your story, and I really wanted to write about what it was like for our soldiers who come back, as they do so often now, not to big army bases, but to little towns. They come from places like here, and Paris, and Rumford, and how they deal with that. And I thought I had a number of military people who I'd already introduced in the stories. So that was One Was a Soldier was talking about that and the issues. It was very dear to my heart, I would say, to write that one. Again, that was a big, sprawling story. It has 8 viewpoint characters. It really tells a big tale with a lot of kind of complicated chronology, and so the next book, Through the Evil Days, was a reaction to that. I wanted to write something that was really tightly focused, very streamlined. And when my agent said, okay, what's it going to be about? And I said, it's Russ and Claire trapped in a cabin on an ice-choked lake with killers after them. And she said, great, write that. And that is what it is. It focuses very tightly on Russ and Claire, and back at the Millerskill Police Department on 2 young officers, Hadley Knox and Kevin Flynn. And it's another ticking clock mystery. It takes place in, well, not quite ticking clock. Everybody has a 7-day deadline that they have to meet, thus the name Through the Evil Days. My original title for it was 7 Whole Days, actually, but booksellers didn't like that. The one that I'm working on now, the 9th book, is called Hid from Our Eyes. And it's about fathers and sons and the relationships that men have that are like fathers and sons, mentors and mentees. And of course there's also multiple murders in it. But it's interesting enough, when I write, the murders are the last thing that I think of. I always think about what I want to write about. There's always something like that. I want to write about soldiers coming back. I want to write about the relationships between older men and younger men, and how that substitutes for fathers and what they learn from each other. And then I have to figure out how to get a murder in there, and then I have to sweat bullets trying to figure out how to make it tricky, because that's hard for me. And that brings us up to date. So let's do questions.